In 1212, the most powerful Islamic empire in Western Europe faced an army it believed it could crush. By nightfall, tens of thousands were dead. An empire was broken, and the balance of Spain shifted forever. This wasn't just a battle, it was an execution. For nearly a century, one power dominated the western edge of the Islamic world. From the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the heart of Iberia, the Almohad Empire ruled with an authority few dared to challenge. Its armies had crushed rebellions, erased rival dynasties, and humiliated Christian kingdoms again and again. To its leaders, this dominance was not luck, it was proof. Proof that God favored them, proof that resistance was futile, proof that victory was inevitable, and that belief was their greatest weakness. By the early 12th century, the Almohads were not just a military power, they were an ideological state. Their rule was built on strict religious unity, centralized command, and absolute obedience. Soldiers did not fight merely for land or wealth, they fought to defend divine order itself. That mindset shaped everything. It shaped how commanders planned, it shaped how soldiers obeyed, and it shaped how failure was understood, or rather, not understood at all. Because empires that believe they cannot lose stop preparing for the possibility that they might. From the Almohad perspective, the Christian kingdoms to the north were fragmented, squabbling, and weak. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, rivals more than allies. They had been defeated before, often, decisively. Why would this time be any different? This confidence was reinforced by numbers. Almohad forces were vast, drawn from across North Africa and Al-Andalus. Veteran infantry, elite guards, cavalry hardened by years of campaigns. Against them stood an army that was smaller, poorly supplied, and stitched together by necessity rather than unity. On paper, the outcome looked predetermined, but paper does not account for fear. It does not account for exhaustion, and it does not account for what happens when belief replaces adaptability. Inside the Almohad command structure, dissent was dangerous. Questioning strategy could be seen as questioning faith itself. Retreat was not just tactical failure, it was ideological collapse. And so the empire marched forward, confident that force and righteousness would do what they always had. What the Almohads failed to see was that their enemies were no longer fighting to win territory. They were fighting to survive. And when survival replaces ambition, armies behave differently. By the summer of 1212, both sides were moving toward a confrontation neither could avoid. One empire certain of its supremacy, one coalition desperate enough to risk annihilation. Neither fully understood what was about to be lost, because the battle ahead would not simply decide who controlled a region, it would decide which worldview would endure and which would begin to collapse under its own certainty. By the early 13th century, the Iberian Peninsula was not divided by a simple Christian-Muslim line. It was fractured by rivalries, distrust, and memory. To the south, the Almohad state governed from a distance that mattered more than it appeared. Power flowed from North Africa into Al-Andalus through governors, tax collectors, and military commanders who were expected to enforce unity and orthodoxy. The system was efficient but rigid. Decisions traveled downward. Doubts did not travel upward. Religion was the glue. The Almohads had risen as reformers, condemning what they saw as corruption and compromise among earlier rulers. In practice, that meant strict doctrine, limited tolerance for dissent, and an expectation that society would bend to belief, not the other way around. This created discipline. It also created pressure. North of the frontier, the Christian kingdoms were anything but unified. Castile competed with Aragon. Aragon eyed Mediterranean expansion. Navarre worried about being swallowed by both. Alliances shifted with marriages, borders, and grudges. Cooperation was rare, temporary, and usually forced by crisis. Yet pressure was building. For decades, Christian rulers had lost ground, paid tribute, and watched cities fall. Their resources were thinner, their armies smaller, but they shared something the Almohads did not fully appreciate: proximity. These kings fought on land they could not abandon. Their defeats were personal, their retreats had nowhere to go. Religion mattered here, too, but differently. The idea of crusade reframed the conflict. It transformed regional survival into sacred obligation. It brought foreign volunteers, papal legitimacy, and just as important, a moral clarity that erased old rivalries, if only briefly. Men who would never have marched together now stood under the same banners, not because they trusted one another, but because the alternative was extinction. This was not a clash of equals, it was a collision of systems. One side relied on centralized authority, doctrinal certainty, and the momentum of past victories. The other relied on fragile cooperation, improvised logistics, and the simple reality that losing meant the end of their world as they knew it. Both sides misread the moment. The Almohads believed pressure would fracture the coalition. It usually did. The Christians believed faith would compensate for numbers. Sometimes it had. But beneath these assumptions lay deeper forces: economic strain, political legitimacy, and the psychology of leadership under threat. Taxes had risen in Almohad territories to fund distant campaigns. Loyalty had thinned. Meanwhile, Christian rulers faced internal resistance from nobles who questioned the cost of yet another war. By the time armies began to move in 1212, neither side was marching from a position of comfort. They were marching because the structures behind them allowed no alternative. And when systems leave no room to retreat, the battlefield becomes more than a place of combat. It becomes a reckoning. At the center of the approaching storm stood Muhammad al-Nasir, ruler of the Almohad Caliphate. On paper, his position looked inassailable. He commanded vast territories, controlled deep reserves of manpower, and inherited the authority of a dynasty built on religious reform and military success. But power at this scale came with a trap. Once an empire defines itself as divinely sanctioned, compromise becomes dangerous. Muhammad al-Nasir did not rule as a flexible politician, he ruled as a symbol. Every campaign was a test of legitimacy. Every victory reinforced belief. Every hesitation risked unraveling the narrative that held the empire together. By 1212, that narrative was under strain. Earlier Almohad campaigns were costly. Maintaining control over distant Iberian territories required constant force. Governors demanded reinforcements, taxes rose, local resentment quietly grew. None of this could be publicly acknowledged. To admit weakness would invite revolt, not only in Al-Andalus, but across North Africa itself. For al-Nasir, retreat was not a military option, it was a political confession. Within the Almohad system, authority flowed from certainty. Commanders were expected to execute orders, not debate them. Religious doctrine reinforced this hierarchy. Obedience was virtue, doubt was deviation. The result was cohesion, but also blindness. Warnings existed. Scouts reported difficult terrain. Advisors noted the unusual cooperation among Christian kingdoms. Supply lines stretched long and thin across hostile ground. Yet these signals competed with something far more powerful: precedent. The Almohads had faced coalitions before. They had broken them before. History, as the court remembered it, was on their side. And history can be intoxicating. As the Caliph prepared for confrontation, pressure closed in from every direction. Clerics expected a demonstration of divine favor. Commanders expected decisive orders. Subjects expected reassurance that the empire remained strong. Standing still would satisfy no one. So the empire moved. Al-Nasir committed fully, not because conditions were ideal, but because partial commitment would expose uncertainty. The army that marched north carried not just weapons and banners, but the psychological weight of an empire that had convinced itself it could not afford doubt. This was leadership under absolutism. Not reckless in intent, but rigid in execution. And rigidity on a battlefield shaped by chance, exhaustion, and human fear is rarely forgiven. By choosing confrontation over caution, al-Nasir was not simply defending territory, he was defending the idea that the Almohad state was still inevitable. Soon that idea would be tested, not by theology or tradition, but by what happens when plans collide with reality. From the outside, the Christian response to the Almohad advance looked fragile, almost reckless. The kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre had spent generations fighting one another. Borders were contested, trust was thin, alliances rarely survived success, let alone failure. Coordinating armies across rival courts was slow, expensive, and politically dangerous. Under normal conditions, such a coalition would have collapsed before it ever reached the battlefield. But 1212 was not a normal year. At the center of this gamble stood Alfonso VIII of Castile, a ruler who understood that survival sometimes demands unity without trust. Previous defeats had taught him a hard lesson. Castile could not face the Almohads alone, neither could anyone else. So the appeal went beyond politics. The war was framed as existential. With papal backing, the conflict was declared a crusade, not merely a regional struggle, but a defense of Christendom itself. That distinction mattered. It opened routes of legitimacy, attracted foreign volunteers, and temporarily silenced rivalries that would otherwise have doomed cooperation. Temporarily. Even with religious support, the coalition was unstable. Thousands who initially joined the march deserted before contact with the enemy. Some feared the size of the Almohad host. Others ran out of supplies. Many simply lost faith that victory was possible. By the time the army reached the frontier, it was far smaller than its original strength. What remained was not an ideal force, it was hardened one. These were not soldiers chasing glory or spoils. They were men who had already decided that retreat would only delay defeat. Their kingdoms lay behind them, their families lay behind them. If the Almohads broke through, there would be no second line of defense. This reality reshaped behavior. Commanders coordinated despite suspicion. Logistics were improvised rather than perfected. Decisions were made quickly, not elegantly. The coalition did not move like a well-oiled machine, but it moved with urgency. That urgency mattered. While the Almohads advanced with confidence built on doctrine and precedent, the Christian coalition advanced with something more volatile: desperation. Desperation compresses time, it strips away debate, it forces alignment where ideology alone cannot. In another year, under different circumstances, this alliance would have failed before the first clash. Rival kings would have argued, supplies would have broken down, leadership would have fractured. But in 1212, pressure replaced harmony, and pressure held. As the two forces drew closer, the imbalance remained clear. One side still possessed numbers, experience, and the momentum of empire. The other possessed none of those things. What it possessed instead was the willingness to risk everything in a single moment. And on the battlefield ahead, that willingness would collide with an empire that had forgotten how to imagine losing. The place where empires test themselves is rarely chosen for comfort. The armies converged near Las Navas de Tolosa, a harsh stretch of land at the edge of the Sierra Morena. The terrain was unforgiving, narrow passes, uneven ground, and limited water. In summer heat, it punished hesitation and magnified exhaustion. For the Almohads, the location appeared favorable: high ground, defensive depth, and space to deploy their superior numbers. Their commanders believed terrain would amplify strength, not expose weakness. Camps were organized with confidence, discipline enforced, and elite units positioned to absorb any frontal assault. But terrain does not only shape movement, it shapes psychology. As night fell, the contrast between the two camps became clear. In the Almohad camp, belief was order. Fires burned in controlled lines, guards rotated on schedule. Soldiers trusted that the structure surrounding them, command, doctrine, and numbers, would carry them through. Fear existed, but it was muted by certainty. Many believed tomorrow would simply confirm what history already had. In the Christian camp, the mood was different. There was no illusion of superiority. Men slept lightly, if at all. Supplies were thin. Armor felt heavier in the heat. Commanders knew that their line could break if coordination failed even once. But there was also clarity. They had reached the end of retreat. This difference mattered more than numbers. The Almohad command made their final miscalculation that night, not tactical, but psychological. They expected the coalition to behave like it always had, to hesitate, fracture, or withdraw under pressure. Plans were built around containment and attrition, not shock. They did not prepare for recklessness. They did not prepare for an enemy willing to risk everything in a single rupture. As darkness settled, both sides believed they understood the morning ahead. One trusted in inevitability, the other trusted in necessity. Neither yet understood that by sunrise, control would matter less than momentum, and belief would collapse faster than formations. The battlefield was quiet, but it was not calm. It was waiting. At first light, the illusion of control still held. The Almohad army formed with discipline. Infantry anchored the center, cavalry waited on the flanks. Behind them stood layers of reserves, designed not for improvisation, but for certainty. The plan was straightforward: absorb the initial pressure, exhaust the attackers, then counter with overwhelming force. It was a plan built for superiority, not chaos. The Christian coalition advanced unevenly, compressed by terrain and limited visibility. Their lines were thinner, their coordination imperfect. To Almohad commanders, this looked familiar, another force straining under its own weakness. The opening clashes reinforced that belief. Almohad infantry pushed forward with confidence, driving back sections of the Christian line. Missiles fell, shields locked, the pressure told. Parts of the coalition bent, and for a moment it seemed the battle would follow expectation: resistance first, collapse later. But something was different. Instead of withdrawing, the Christian formations kept returning. Units that should have broken regrouped and pressed again. There was no elegant maneuvering, only repeated, concentrated force aimed at the same points, not everywhere, somewhere. This created confusion. Almohad commanders began issuing local adjustments, minor redeployments meant to stabilize pressure, but those adjustments depended on precise timing and unquestioned obedience. In the heat, under dust and noise, execution lagged. Momentum started to matter. The Christian advance was not smooth, but it was relentless. Every step forward increased contact, noise, and disorder. Units collided, signals were missed, commanders on both sides struggled to see beyond their immediate front. Here, the first cracks appeared. The Almohad system assumed control from above. Orders flowed downward, but battle does not wait for clarity. As pressure mounted, junior officers hesitated, waiting for instructions that came too late or not at all. The structure that had once guaranteed discipline now slowed response. Meanwhile, the coalition fought differently. Leadership was closer to the line. Decisions were crude but immediate. If a push failed, it was repeated. If a gap appeared, it was exploited without debate. This was not strategy in the academic sense. It was survival translated into action. The battlefield grew louder, dust obscured vision, formations lost cohesion. The initial Almohad advantage narrowed, not because of superior tactics, but because certainty was being replaced by friction. And friction favors those prepared to accept disorder. By the midpoint of the fighting, neither side had won, but one had lost something essential, the confidence that control was guaranteed. From that moment on, the battle was no longer about numbers. It was about whether belief could survive pressure. And belief, once cracked, collapses faster than steel. The turning point did not arrive with a single command or a clean maneuver. It arrived as pressure. The Christian coalition concentrated its force again and again at the same sector, an area the Almohads believed was secure, guarded by elite troops and reinforced by depth. From a distance, the formation still looked intact. Banners stood, lines held, orders continued to flow. But on the ground, something had shifted. Fatigue slowed reaction, dust choked visibility. Units that were meant to rotate forward hesitated, unsure whether support was coming. The certainty that had anchored the Almohad defense began to erode, not everywhere, but enough. Then the breach happened, not as a grand charge, but as a rupture. A section of the defensive barrier protecting the rear command area gave way under sustained pressure. Once that line failed, the logic of the battlefield changed instantly. This was no longer a controlled engagement at the front, it was penetration. And penetration spreads fear faster than casualties. News traveled unevenly, shouted warnings, fleeing runners, fragments of understanding. Some units believed it was a temporary setback, others believed the center had collapsed entirely. In the absence of clear information, imagination filled the gaps. This was the moment the Almohad system could not absorb. Their command structure relied on belief in order. When soldiers believed the rear was threatened, the assumption of inevitability shattered. The elite guard, once a symbol of divine protection, became a focal point of panic. If they were vulnerable, then nothing was secure. Formation gave way to reaction. Some units attempted to counterattack, others turned inward to defend leadership. Others began to pull back, not as a retreat, but as individuals responding to uncertainty. The battlefield fragmented into isolated struggles, each feeding the next wave of fear. The Christian forces sensed it immediately. They did not pause to reorganize, they pushed through the breach, expanding it, turning penetration into collapse. The advance was uneven, chaotic, and brutally effective, not because it was elegant, but because it denied the Almohads time to recover control. What had begun as a test of endurance became a crisis of belief. Once soldiers believe defeat is possible, cohesion becomes optional, discipline becomes fragile, orders become suggestions. The empire did not lose its army in that moment, but it lost the authority that made the army function as one. By the time the fighting reached the command center, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Almohad leadership survived the day, their inevitability did not, and with it collapsed the illusion that had sustained their dominance for generations. Victory on a medieval battlefield did not end when resistance broke. That was when the killing accelerated. As Almohad formations collapsed, retreat turned chaotic. Units that had marched in disciplined columns now fled along narrow passes clogged with men, animals, and equipment. The terrain that had once promised defensive advantage became a trap. There was no clean withdrawal, only flight. Pursuit was relentless. Christian forces, exhausted but driven by momentum, pressed forward. What followed was not a battle in any organized sense, but a rout. Isolated Almohad groups were cut down or scattered. Command structures dissolved completely. Orders no longer mattered. Survival did. Casualty figures from medieval sources vary widely, but all agree on one point: the losses were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Almohad soldiers did not return south. Many died not in formation, but alone, caught in ravines, overtaken on open ground, or abandoned by units that no longer existed. The psychological damage was even greater. For the first time in living memory, the Almohad army had not merely been defeated, it had been exposed. The aura of invincibility that once preceded it vanished in a single day. Survivors carried that knowledge home. So did the silence. Cities in Al-Andalus waited for reinforcements that never came. Governors realized they could no longer rely on immediate military support from North Africa. Local elites began reassessing loyalty. Rebellion did not erupt overnight, but doubt spread faster than any army. The Caliph Muhammad an-Nasr survived and withdrew, but survival was no longer enough. In imperial politics, defeat without explanation is fatal. The empire still existed on maps, but it no longer existed in the minds of its subject. And once that happens, collapse becomes a process rather than an event. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa did not destroy the Almohads immediately. It made their destruction unavoidable. In the years that followed, the effects compounded. Authority weakened across Al-Andalus. Local rulers asserted independence. Tax revenues declined. Recruitment slowed. The centralized system that had once projected power across continents struggled to enforce obedience even within its core territories. North Africa was no refuge. News of defeat undermined the religious legitimacy on which Almohad rule depended. Rivals and reform movements re-emerged. Provinces questioned why they should obey a leadership that had lost divine favor on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms advanced, not recklessly, but methodically. With Almohad power broken, the balance of the Reconquista shifted permanently. Future campaigns met resistance, but no longer faced a unified, confident empire. What had once been defensive wars for survival became wars of expansion. This is why historians return to this battle again and again, not because of tactics alone, not because of casualty numbers, but because it marked the moment when an imperial system failed its own test. The Almohads had built an empire on certainty, certainty of belief, certainty of obedience, certainty of victory. That structure worked until it encountered an enemy that no longer feared loss. When desperation met rigidity, rigidity broke. Las Navas de Tolosa reminds us of a pattern that repeats across history. Empires rarely fall when they are weak. They fall when they are confident, inflexible, and unprepared for the moment when belief collapses faster than armies. And once that moment arrives, recovery is not a matter of strength. It is no longer possible at all.